For today's New Testament Bible study, we'll be looking at Colossians 1:19-23. Paul states, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." In verse 19, Paul says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." Of course, the "in him" is referring to Christ. Notice Jesus is not part God, but he is the fullness of God. When the second person of the Trinity took on flesh, it was an addition, not a subtraction. God did not subtract his deity, rather he added humanity. He goes on to say, "And through him, through Christ, to reconcile to himself all things, whether on heaven or on earth, making peace by the blood of his cross." Notice how Christ reconciles all things. This reminds me of Romans chapter 8, which speaks of creation itself also being affected by the fall. Beginning in Romans 8:19, Paul states, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him," or Adam, "who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves." So the reconciliation that Christ brought through his death and resurrection was meant to start the undoing of the curse of Genesis 3. In verse 21, Paul states, "And you who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds." So in verse 21, Paul is talking about our former condition, and it's not good. We were alienated, we were hostile in mind, and we were doing evil deeds. In verse 22, things change. He says, "He has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him." So now here is our current condition. We have been reconciled, we are presented holy and blameless and above reproach before him. In verse 23, he says, "If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." There's not any doubt attached to this "if." In the Greek, it's more clear that Paul is saying something positive. It's as though he's saying, if indeed you continue in the faith, and I know you will. And those who are really in Christ do continue in the faith. And other marks are this stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, so there's no falling away. And this gospel, according to Paul, is indeed progressing by the time he writes this letter in the early 60s. Praise be to God, who has taken us from the alienation, the hostility, the doing evil of verse 21, and has taken us to verse 22, where we've been reconciled by his action. Notice it's by his death. God is the one who has done the work. Notice we're not presenting ourselves before him holy and blameless, but he is presenting us holy and blameless and above reproach before him. This is why salvation is a gift of God. Our only responsibility in this whole transaction is to respond in faith. Be encouraged by this passage today. Look over it some more, commit it to memory, and I'll see you next time.